Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are opening a text that functions almost like a blueprint. It's a map of the invisible architecture that surrounds us. We're looking at Powers and Prospects, Language, Politics, and Human Rights by Noam Chomsky.
And this is a really interesting one because it isn't just a collection of political hot takes or, essays. This book is doing something really specific. It's trying to bridge two worlds that, for most people, seem completely separate.
Completely. On one side, you have the biological wiring of the human mind. I mean, how we actually think, how we speak, how we create language. And then on the other side, you have the institutional wiring of international power.
Right. How states act, how economies are structured, how the media decides what's news. They seem like totally different fields of study.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the central inquiry here is, I think, just massive. Chomsky is basically asking, how do these invisible structural forces, from the very biology inside our skulls to the political architecture of the globe, how do they determine what we can even say, what we're allowed to see, and ultimately how power operates?
And the book's answer, the bridge between those two worlds,
Is human nature. That's the link. The argument is you can't understand one without the other.
which is a really heavy concept to start a deep dive with. But it's so crucial here because usually when people talk about Chomsky, they see two different people, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. There's the famous linguist at MIT, the scientist who revolutionized his field, and then there's the political dissident, the critic. And people often ask, what's the connection?
And this book is the answer. It argues they are actually analyzing the same fundamental system, just at different levels of magnification.
That's right. And the stakes, according to the text, couldn't be higher. The argument here is that if we misunderstand the nature of our own minds, if we believe we're just, blank slates, then we completely misunderstand our capacity for freedom. We start to believe we are just machines to be programmed.
And the flip side of that coin.
Conversely, if we misunderstand the nature of state power, if we buy into the stories the state tells about itself, we end up becoming complicit in atrocity. We become cogs in the machine we don't even see.
So just to be really clear for everyone listening, our goal today isn't to review the book in the traditional sense. We're not doing a biography of the author, and it's not a review of his writing style.
No, not at all. Our mission is to use the text to map the patterns of what the book calls manufactured perception and institutional pathology. We want to see the structure, not just the individual events or personalities.
Okay, so to see that structure, we have to understand the context. Where and when does this book appear?
So let's set the scene. The book was published in 1996, and you really cannot overstate how important that context is. The Cold War is over, the Berlin Wall has fallen, the Soviet Union has collapsed.
And in the West, particularly in the United States and Britain, there's this mood of absolute victory.
It's triumphalism. I mean, you have Francis Fukuyama's famous essay, The End of History. The idea was that the big questions had been settled. Liberal democracy and free markets had won, debate was over, and we were entering a golden age of peace and, global stability.
Right. The New World Order, as it was being called after the first Gulf War.
Precisely. And Powers and Prospects lands in the middle of this celebration and is, to put it mildly, a demolition of that entire narrative. Chomsky argues that what was being called the New World Order wasn't a victory for democracy at all.
What was it then?
It was what he calls a rollback of the democratic gains that had been won over centuries of popular struggle. It was a consolidation of power in the hands of what he calls private tyranny.
Okay, private tyranny. We're going to have to unpack that. But the core idea is, while the mainstream was popping champagne, this text suggests we were actually seeing the opposite of freedom's victory. We were seeing a system being locked into place where pragmatism...
Which is really just a code word for profit and power.
Right. Where that kind of pragmatism automatically, systemically overrides principle. Things like human rights, international law.
And the really terrifying part of the argument is that this reality is systematically hidden from the public. It's obscured.
How? By whom?
Well, according to the text, it's hidden by an intellectual class journalists, academics, pundits who serve as commissars. That's a very provocative term we definitely need to unpack later.
Yeah.
But first, to really get this, we had to start where the book starts. We have to start with the human mind.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Insight number 1, the biological system of freedom. This all comes from the linguistic section of the book. And I think for a lot of people, the word linguistics sounds incredibly dry. It sounds like, diagramming sentences in school.
Right, has that reputation.
But Chomsky is arguing that linguistics, properly understood, is actually the study of human freedom. How on earth does that work?
It starts with this concept he calls the second cognitive revolution. The first was, Galileo and the scientific revolution. The second one is about the mind. And the core insight is that the human language faculty is an innate biological component of the brain.
So it's not something you just learn by imitation, like a parrot.
Exactly. It's not something you pick up just by habit or by being trained like a lab rat. It's a generative procedure. It's part of our biological endowment, like having arms or a circulatory system.
Generative procedure, that sounds very technical. Let's break that down into plain English.
It just means that with a finite set of tools, a limited vocabulary, and a limited set of grammatical rules in your head, your mind can create and understand a virtually infinite number of new sentences.
So I can say something right now that has never been said before in all of human history.
And I can understand it instantly, and you can understand what I'm saying back. This is what he calls the infinite use of finite means. Think about a child. A child hears a limited number of sentences, but very quickly develops the ability to produce sentences they've never heard before. They aren't just mimicking, they're creating.
So this is a direct rejection of the idea that the mind is a blank slate.
A total rejection. And that is a politically explosive idea. Think about it. If the mind really were a blank slate, as the behaviorists like B.F. Skinner argued, then humans could be molded into anything.
A government or a corporation could theoretically just write whatever program they wanted onto the human personality.
Precisely. A totalitarian state or a corporate marketing department would have a clear path to total control. But if there is an innate structure, if we are biologically wired for this kind of free expression, then we have a human nature that cannot be totally repressed or conditioned away.
So in a way, our own biology is a defense against tyranny. It's like a built-in firewall against total control.
That is absolutely the argument. The text says the mind is designed to create thoughts and sentences that are innovative, that are appropriate to the circumstances, but, and this is the key part, are not caused by them. We aren't just complex machines reacting to stimuli. We are creating.
And this gives a scientific basis for a certain kind of society.
A humanistic conception of society.
Right.
The argument is that a just society should be designed to accommodate and nurture this fundamental human need for creative inquiry, for free expression. It runs completely counter to the behaviorist view that humans are just machines to be programmed and controlled.
Okay, but, and here's the huge tension that runs through the whole book, our current socio-political order is designed to do the exact opposite, isn't it? It's designed to constrain that freedom.
It is. And that creates a massive problem for power, which leads us directly to the second major system analyzed in the book, the intellectual filter system. If human beings are naturally creative, curious, and freedom-seeking, how do you get them to accept a world of hierarchy, war, and vast inequality?
You can't just use force, not in a so-called free society anyway. In a dictatorship, you can just arrest people or shoot them. But the book is specifically focused on societies like the US and Britain.
Correct. In a free society, you can't control people primarily by force, so you have to control what they think. You have to, in the famous phrase, manufacture consent. The text outlines how the intellectual culture, that means universities, media, the pundit class, functions in a way that's very similar to a priesthood or a commissar class in a totalitarian state.
But how? There's no government censor in the newsroom telling reporters what to write.
No, and that's the genius of the system. It's voluntary. The submission is voluntary. The text argues that access to privilege, to prestige, to institutional power is granted to those who internalize the values of the powerful. You learn very quickly what you can and can't say if you want to be taken seriously.
You sort of self-censor.
You self-censor. You adopt the framework of the state without ever being ordered to. The commission of the intellectual, largely unconscious, is to frame reality in a way that protects and justifies state and private power.
And the book uses a really devastating comparison to prove this point, involving two genocides that happened at the exact same time. This is the famous East Timor versus Cambodia case study.
This is maybe the single clearest example in the text of the crisis in perception we talk about on this channel. So let's look at the facts as they're laid out in the source. In the late 1970s, you have two absolutely horrific atrocities happening simultaneously.
Okay, what are they?
On one hand, you have Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot. Massive atrocities, eventually killing, upwards of a quarter of the population. At the exact same time, you have the Indonesian military invading and occupying the small nation of East Timor.
And the scale of the killing there was comparable.
Per capita, it was arguably worse. Indonesia's invasion and occupation led to the deaths of maybe a third of East Timor's population. So you have two genocides, same time, same scale.
But the way they were presented to the public in the West was completely different.
It was night and day. Cambodia was the official enemy. Pol Pot was a communist monster. So the atrocities there were amplified. They were on the front page of the New York Times. There was righteous outrage. The cultural narrative was, look at the evil of our enemy.
And that's a story that serves the state's interests.
Perfectly. It reinforces the idea that we are good and they are evil. Now contrast that with East Timor.
What was the situation there?
In East Timor, the aggressor, Indonesia, under the dictator Suharto, was a crucial strategic ally of the West. They were a bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia. And critically, they were carrying out the invasion using American weapons, with American diplomatic support.
So what happened in the media?
Silence. Near total silence. The text provides the data. In 1978, as the slaughter in East Timor was reaching its absolute peak near genocidal levels, media coverage in the United States and Canada dropped to literally zero.
0 articles.
Zero. And the book's argument is that this is not a coincidence. It's not a mistake. It is a functional output of the system. The system design of the media is to avoid what they call flack and to maintain access to power.
So if you're a journalist and you report on the crimes of an official enemy,
You get rewarded. You win a Pulitzer Prize. You're a brave truth teller.
but if you report on the crimes of your own government or one of its key allies,
You lose access. You get called biased or anti-American. Your sources dry up. You're marginalized. So the incentive structure pushes you away from those stories.
which means the perception of a tragedy isn't determined by the suffering of the victim, it's determined by the agency of the perpetrator. If they do it, it's a genocide. If we do it, or our friends do it, it's what? A blunder. An unfortunate mistake.
Or it's framed as containing communism or restoring stability. Or most often, it simply doesn't exist. It becomes forbidden intellectual territory. The victims become what the book calls unpeople.
Unpeople.
Their suffering doesn't register. They don't generate outrage because they don't generate news coverage. This is the intellectual filter system at work. It ensures that the public, which the text, citing classical democratic theorists, refers to as the great beast, remains a spectator to policy, not a participant.
That's chilling because it suggests that our emotional responses, our outrage, are being managed and directed. We feel like we're reacting naturally to the horrors of the world, but we're actually reacting to a highly curated, highly filtered feed of information.
And that curation, that filtering, isn't random. It serves a very specific economic structure. And that brings us to the third core system the book analyzes, the economic tough love system.
Tough love. That's a phrase the book uses to describe how the economy is supposedly managed. But the argument is that it's not tough love for everyone, is it?
Not even close. The analysis here is that what the book calls really existing capitalist democracy, as opposed to the version in textbooks, operates on a stark dual logic. It's market discipline for the poor and the weak. They have to survive on their own. They're told to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. If they fail, it's their own fault. That's the tough part.
But for the rich and powerful, for the corporate sector,
For them, it's the nanny state. The book details, at length, how the public is forced to subsidize the risks and costs of the corporate sector while the profits are kept private.
this is where the text gets into the Pentagon system. And this is a fascinating part of the argument because usually when we talk about the Pentagon, we're talking about national defense. We're talking about tanks and missiles and soldiers.
Right, that's the public narrative.
But Chomsky argues the Pentagon is actually a core part of the U.S. economy. It's an economic engine.
It's the primary mechanism for public subsidy of the high-tech economy. Think about it. Where did the foundational technologies of the modern economy come from? Computers, the internet itself, GPS, semiconductors, aeronautics, biotechnology. The research and development for these industries is incredibly expensive and extremely risky.
A private company operating in a true free market couldn't afford to take those kinds of risks. The initial investment is too huge, and the chance of failure is too high.
They'd go bankrupt. So who pays for it? The taxpayer funds it via the Pentagon budget. The public pays for all the difficult, expensive, high-risk R&D under the guise of national security. Then, once the technology is viable and profitable, it's handed over to private corporations to market for profit.
So it's the socialization of risk and cost, and the privatization of profit.
That's the formula. And it's a massive transfer of wealth from the public to the private sector. So when we hear politicians talking about the virtues of free markets and getting the government out of the economy,
The text is basically arguing that's a complete myth. It's a rhetorical device.
it's a tool of perception. It's a weapon. The book argues that free market rhetoric is a club used against the poor and against the developing world. We tell them, you can't have subsidies, you can't protect your infant industries. But the masters of the global economy, they would never subject themselves to those rules. They demand state protection. They demand the nanny state.
And this whole system creates what the book calls private tyranny. Let's define that term because it's central.
It's a crucial term. We are trained from birth to think of tyranny as something governments do, the state. But the book argues that the modern corporation operates as a totalitarian structure in its own right.
How so? What's the parallel?
Well, just look at the internal structure of a corporation. Where does power flow from? It's a top-down command structure. Orders come from the top, from the CEO and the board of directors. There is strict hierarchy. There's no accountability to those at the bottom or to the community.
Right. If you work at a big company, you don't get to vote on what the company produces or how it distributes its profits. You follow orders or you're fired.
It's the inverse of democratic control. The text quotes political economist Robert Brady, who described these corporate structures as totalitarian systems where authority proceeds entirely from the top down.
So we have a political system that claims to be a democracy, but it's nested within an economic system that is fundamentally autocratic. And the economic system, the book argues, holds the real power.
Which leads to the rollback of the social contract that we mentioned earlier. The goal of this system, according to the analysis, is to dismantle the gains made by labor movements and popular struggles over the last century, things like unions, welfare, public education, is to turn the public back into a collection of isolated consumers rather than active citizens in a democracy.
And this domestic economic system connects directly to how the country acts on the world stage, which brings us to the fourth system, the geopolitical stability system. We've looked at the mind, the media, and the economy. Now we're looking at the world map. How is the globe organized, according to this text?
The book is very blunt on this point. The global order is maintained by what it calls the rule of force. But that reality is disguised with a much nicer sounding word, stability.
Stability is one of those words that sounds inherently good. I mean, who doesn't want stability? Chaos is bad, stability is good.
Of course. But in the internal lexicon of state planning, stability has a very specific and technical meaning. It means obedience. A region of the world is considered stable if it is following the orders of the dominant Western powers, primarily the United States, and serving the interests of foreign investors.
So a country could be a brutal dictatorship, torturing its own citizens, but if it allows its resources to be extracted and its labor to be exploited by Western corporations, it's considered stable.
Precisely. And a country could be a vibrant, popular democracy, but if it decides to use its own resources for its own people, that's defined as instability or a crisis, and it becomes a target for intervention.
The book uses the example of the Middle East to illustrate this.
Yes. The text has a whole section that dissects the so-called peace process. We're all conditioned to think of the peace process as this noble, good faith effort to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But the book argues it's actually what it calls a rejectionist framework.
What does rejectionist mean in this context?
It means that one side, in this case the U.S. and Israel, according to the sources in the book, has consistently rejected the broad international consensus for peace. For decades, that consensus, supported by the UN, by Europe, by the Arab states, even by the PLO since the 1970s, has been a two-state settlement based on the 1967 borders.
But the U.S. has a different strategic goal.
According to the text, the U.S. strategic conception for the region requires Israeli military dominance. Israel functions as a local cop on the beat.
Local cop on the beat. That's a direct quote from the text.
It is. It's a concept that goes back to the Nixon Doctrine. The idea is that the U.S. can't police the entire world directly. It's too expensive and it's too unpopular at home. So you deputize and arm reliable regional powers to maintain order on your behalf.
So you assign these local cops.
You do. In the Middle East, that's Israel and historically Iran under the Shah. In Southeast Asia, during the time frame of this book, the key local cop was Indonesia under the Suharto dictatorship.
And these local cops are basically given a free rein to manage their neighborhoods, to use force and violence, as long as they ultimately serve the interests of the great powers.
Exactly. Which brings us right back to East Timor. Why was Indonesia allowed to invade and occupy a sovereign nation, killing a third of its population, with active Western support? Because Suharto was our local cop. He was ensuring stability in Southeast Asia. He was keeping the region open for business, for resource extraction.
There's a document mentioned in the book, a leaked cable, that I found absolutely jaw-dropping. It's called the Wolcott Doctrine. Can we talk about that for a second?
Yes, this is a critical piece of evidence in the book's argument. Richard Wolcott was the Australian ambassador to Indonesia in 1975, right at the time of the invasion. In a secret cable back to his government, he laid out the situation.
And what did he advise?
He advised the Australian government to take a pragmatic rather than a principled stand. Those were his exact words.
Pragmatic rather than principled.
He explicitly argued that Australia's national interest, which, when you decode it, really means the interest of Australian and American energy corporations, dictated that they should support Indonesia's annexation of East Timor.
And his reasoning was?
His reasoning, laid out in the cable, was that it would be much easier to negotiate a favorable treaty for the oil and gas rights in the Timor Gap, the sea between Timor and Australia, with a stable authoritarian Indonesia, than it would be with a newly independent and possibly unstable East Timor.
So the sovereign rights, and indeed the lives of hundreds of thousands of human beings, were literally weighed on a scale against the ease of negotiating an oil contract. And the oil contract won.
That is the system output. The book's point is not that Richard Wolcott is some uniquely evil man. It's that he was a good bureaucrat, functioning perfectly within a system where pragmatism, which means profit, automatically and logically overrides principle, which means human rights. That is the rule of force in action.
Okay, let's just step back for a moment and try to map this whole thing out explicitly. We've talked about these four big systems: biological, intellectual, economic, geopolitical. But they aren't separate silos, are they? They all interlock and feed into each other.
They're completely integrated. It's one big machine. Let's try to map the key components as the book lays them out. First, you have the actors.
Right. Who are the players in this system?
First and most important, you have the great beast. That's the general public.
Yeah.
In elite planning documents and thinking, the public is viewed as confused, ignorant, meddlesome, and potentially very dangerous if they get organized. Their role is to be distracted and marginalized.
Okay, then you have the principal architects.
That's Adam Smith's term, which Chomsky adopts. These are the owners of the society, the merchants, manufacturers, and investors. They are the ones who craft state policy to ensure that their own interests are, as Smith put it, most peculiarly attended to.
And they need someone to sell their policies to the great beast.
Exactly. And that's the role of the commissars, the intellectuals, the respectable journalists, the academic experts. Their institutional role is to construct the narratives that justify the actions of the architects. They're the ones who explain why stability requires selling arms to dictators, or why jobs requires cutting environmental regulations.
And finally, on the ground, you have the local cops.
The regional powers, like Suharto's Indonesia or apartheid South Africa, who are armed and funded to maintain order and keep their regions compliant.
And holding this entire structure together are the narratives, the tools of perception. We talked about how jobs is used as a code word for profits.
Right. A politician almost never says, we need to approve this weapon sale to enrich the shareholders of this defense contractor. They say, we need this deal for the jobs. It reframes a subsidy for the rich as a benefit for the working class.
And then there's a big one, enduring truths.
This is the overarching myth that foreign policy is driven by noble, altruistic motives, like promoting democracy and human rights. The book contrasts this with the internal planning record, citing documents like George Kennan's Policy Planning Study 23 from 1948.
What did that one say?
Kennan, a major architect of the Cold War, wrote bluntly that the U.S., with 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6% of its population, cannot afford the luxury of altruism. He said we need to stop talking about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization, and deal in straight power concepts.
So that's the reality in the planning document.
That's the reality. But the enduring truth presented to the public is the exact opposite, and this all creates a terrifyingly effective feedback loop. You mentioned the unpeople loop.
Yeah, walk me through that again. How does it work?
Okay, so think about the mechanism with East Timor. Step 1. Indonesia, a U.S. ally, invades. The victims are therefore unpeople. Step 2. Because they are victims of an ally, the commissar class, the media, doesn't report on the atrocities. Step 3. Because there's no reporting, there is no public outrage. The great beast is kept in the dark.
And with no outrage, there's no pressure on politicians.
Exactly. Step 4. There is no political pressure to stop the arms sales to Indonesia. In fact, they increase. Step 5. The arms sales continue. The atrocities continue, and stability is maintained for the oil companies. The systems work perfectly, and it reinforces itself.
It persists because it's functional.
It is ideologically functional for the architects of power. It successfully filters out the inconvenient facts that would disrupt the flow of power and profit, and any structural critique of this system gets marginalized as conspiracy theory or anti-Americanism.
You know, this book was written in 1996, that's what, almost 30 years ago? But when I was reading this section on corporate personhood, it feels like it could have been written this morning.
That's because the analysis is about deep institutional structures, not just fleeting current events. The book discusses this bizarre legal fiction where the modern corporation demands all the rights of a person, freedom of speech, protection under the law, but operates with the internal structure of a dictatorship and has none of the responsibilities of a person.
And that has only intensified since 1996.
Massively. With
Mhm.
court decisions like Citizens United, the power of these private tyrannies to dominate the political sphere has grown exponentially.
And the Pentagon system, we're still seeing that play out today, right? The names of the hot new technologies change. Maybe it's AI and quantum computing now instead of just the early internet, but the basic funding model is identical.
It is. The defense industrial base remains the primary mechanism for what is, in effect, state industrial policy. It's how the state shields the most powerful corporate sectors from true market discipline.
And what about that cultural pattern you mentioned, the anti-politics of the market? The book talks about this trend of removing decisions from the public arena and putting them in the hands of the market.
This is the absolute essence of what we now call neoliberalism. If you take a decision, say, about healthcare policy or environmental protection or housing, and you move it from the public arena, which is at least theoretically democratic,
One person, one vote.
right, and you place it in the market, you are fundamentally disenfranchising the population. The market is not one person, one vote. The market is $1, one vote. So the more you shift decision-making to the market, the less democratic the society becomes. Power shifts from the public to concentrated private capital.
What really strikes me reading this now is the structural recurrence. The Wolcott doctrine choosing oil over human rights, that wasn't a one-time moral failure. We see that exact pattern play out over and over again wherever national interest, meaning corporate interest, conflicts with international law.
It recurs because the institutional incentives remain the same. If a diplomat takes a principled stand and as a result their country loses a major resource contract to a competitor, they are judged to have failed in their institutional role.
But if they take a pragmatic stand, look the other way at a genocide, and secure the resources for domestic corporations.
They are judged to have succeeded. They get promoted. The system selects for the Wolcott doctrine. It's not about the individual's morality. It's about the logic of the institution.
This brings us right back to the core theme of our whole channel, the crisis in perception. The book is making a powerful argument against the bad man theory of history.
Yes, this is so crucial to understand. The analysis is not that the president or the CEO or the diplomat is a bad person in a comic book villain sense. It's that they're fulfilling an institutional role. The book argues that if you took a dedicated dissident, a true believer in human rights, and placed them in a position of power as CEO of a major corporation, for instance,
The system would either force them to conform to its logic or it would spit them out.
it would crush them. A CEO who consistently decided to prioritize human rights and environmental sustainability over shareholder profit would be sued by their shareholders and promptly replaced by the board of directors. The institution dictates the behavior, not the other way around.
And that's what explains the socially manufactured perception, the huge difference in how we, the public, were taught to see Cambodia versus East Timor wasn't an accident, it was a product.
It was a manufactured product. The intellectual filter system produces the perception that aligns with the interests of state power. So we perceive the crimes of our enemies as uniquely evil, stemming from their wicked ideology, while the crimes of our own state or its clients are framed as unfortunate blunders or complex civil wars or just necessary evils for stability.
The text points to this huge blind spot in Western liberal culture, this deep-seated refusal to apply the same moral and legal standards to ourselves that we so eagerly apply to our enemies.
And that, according to the book's conclusion, is the ultimate test of moral integrity. It is easy to stand up and condemn the crimes of others. That costs nothing. In fact, you're often rewarded for it. The true moral burden, the responsibility of the writer or intellectual, is to look in the mirror.
To speak the truth about the crimes of one's own state.
Why? Because those are the crimes for which you share responsibility as a citizen. And more importantly, those are the crimes you can actually do something to stop.
But the entire system we've just described is designed to prevent exactly that. It's designed to push our gaze outward, to find monsters abroad, rather than looking at the systems of power we live within and support.
Which leads us to the final reflection in the book. It really forces you to think about this idea of intellectual responsibility. The writer, the journalist, the academic, they face a choice. They can be commissars, participating, consciously or not, in the engineering of consent. Or they can try to dismantle this crisis in perception by telling the truth about how power really works.
But the book ends on a note that, well, it's not exactly optimistic in an easy, feel-good sense, but it is deeply hopeful. It circles all the way back to the beginning. It goes back to the biology.
It does. It goes back to that first insight about the human mind. The final question the book leaves us with is this. If the human mind is truly designed for infinite creative potential, if the desire for freedom is a biological imperative, then these rigid systems of control we've built are inherently fragile.
Because they are fighting against our own nature.
They are. The book suggests that the old mole of freedom, to borrow a phrase from Marx, is always burrowing beneath the surface of these oppressive structures. You can build these massive, intimidating systems of private tyranny and manufactured consent, but you are building them on the very unstable ground of a biological organism that is fundamentally wired to create, to inquire, and to seek liberty.
So the real struggle isn't just political or economic, it's almost evolutionary. It's a conflict between system and biology.
It's a struggle between the rigid, hierarchical systems we've built and the fluid, creative, free nature of our own minds. And that leaves us with an open question. Why do we so often accept a social order based on subordination and control when our very nature cries out for something else? Is the struggle for liberty a biological imperative that systems of power are constantly trying and maybe ultimately failing to suppress?
And that's the question we want to leave you with. Is the structure of the world that has been built around you fighting against the fundamental structure of your own mind?
And if you conclude that it is, what are you going to do about it?
This deep dive was based on Powers and Prospects, Language, Politics, and Human Rights by Noam Chomsky. If you want to understand the specific documents we talked about, the Wolcott Cable, Kennan's planning papers, you really need to read the book. It maps the architecture of power in a way very few texts do.
It's a dense read, for sure, but an absolutely essential one if you want to understand these systems.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.